Bona nit. Avui és serà la primera sessió en què haurem fet al matí un debat a la universitat, en aquest cas a 7 a la Facultat de Lletres, i a la tarda fem la conferència magistral, que anomenem. Aquest format es repetirà el dimarts que ve i en 2 dimarts encara més. És a dir, a partir d'avui hi haurà 3 setmanes més on respectarà la mateixa estructura, un debat al matí en un espai de la facultat i una conferència magistral per part d'un entès internacional aquí a la seu del Mercadal. Avui tenim entre nosaltres Michel Seymour. Ell és quebequès, és catedràtic de filosofia a la Universitat de Montreal. La seva recerca sobretot ha tocat la qüestió del nacionalisme i les problemàtiques internes dels estats liberals de naturalesa plurinacional. Ha publicat una multitud, és molt llarga la seva publicació sobre aquestes qüestions, però no només en aquestes qüestions. I si hem de destacar publicacions, podríem destacar, per exemple, Penser, Langage et Communauté del 94, La Nation en Question del 99, Les Paris de la Démesure el 2001, L'Institution du Langage el 2005, o l'any 2008 quan va publicar De la tolérance à la reconnaissance. Aquest llibre va merèixer el Premi del Llibre de l'Associació Canadenca de Filosofia i el Premi Jean-Charles Falardeau el 2010. Ell és un especialista i una persona que coneix molt bé i que, jo diria, debat discuteix i presenta batalla discursiva, en dialèctica, en qüestions de nacionalisme i de secessionisme. Com sabem tots, en el Quebec hi ha una lluita encara ara que fa anys que dura, semblant en molts aspectes a la situació, a la lluita que tenim aquí a Catalunya, i en aquest cicle de debats ens interessava molt que hi hagués una persona representativa del moviment i de la discussió que va tenir lloc allà, que hi hagués una persona d'Escòcia, que hi haguessin catalans, que hi haguessin espanyols, perquè representessin i ens demostressin que els debats que estem tenint aquí no són debats, diríem, que ens aïllen a nosaltres del món, al contrari, que ens situen moltes vegades al món. Michel, c'est un plaisir, un honneur que vous êtes ici avec nous. S'il vous plaît.
I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in English. It's an honor for me to be here in those historical moments, those historical events unfolding and changing every day or so, because I arrived yesterday and I got one version of what's going to happen, and today there's another version of what's going to happen. So history is unfolding under my very eyes. I will try to deliver my speech within an hour, and hopefully I will be successful in doing so. It's a bit philosophical, but as you will probably notice, there are important implications for the things that I'm about to tell you. There are peoples. Peoples exist. The Canadian people exists. The British people exists. The Spanish people exists. But the Quebec people, the Acadian people, and the indigenous peoples of Canada also exist. The Scottish and the Welsh peoples also exist in Great Britain. The Galician, the Basque, and the Catalonian peoples also exist in Spain. There are 200 sovereign states in the world right now, but there are much more peoples than that. Some say that there are thousands of peoples all over the world. So most states contain many different peoples. Indeed, most states are multination states. The problem, however, is that in the minds of most politicians, political scientists, jurists, and philosophers, the only acceptable political model is that of the traditional nation state. That is, a state in which there is only one people. So they tend to ignore the existence of minority peoples within the state. we still do not have at our disposal the tools that would enable us to deal with the fact that some people also exist even if they do not enjoy their own sovereign state. We tend to believe that in order to exist as a people, the population has to be composed of citizens in a sovereign state. Stateless peoples, that is, peoples that do not own a sovereign state, tend to be assimilated to ethnic minorities. The term here, of course, is often used in a pejorative sense. But if I'm right, this view is wrong-headed. We have to acknowledge the existence of stateless peoples. These peoples may very often be numerical minorities. An exception to this is the Flemish people in Belgium. Nevertheless, they cannot be assimilated to the minorities referred to in international law, for they are peoples. So what should we do about stateless peoples? What is the problem that we have to solve? Specifically, why should the very existence of many peoples within the single state constitute a problem? This last question comes at least with three others. Which population are, as a matter of fact, already acknowledged as peoples? Even more pressing is the question of trying to define peoples. So what does it mean to be a people? And finally, what should we do in order to solve the problem? I will very briefly try to answer all these questions in this presentation. If we understand the problem and are able to identify peoples that are already recognized and those that should be recognized on the basis of a good definition, then we shall perhaps be in a position to answer the question concerning what should we do about stateless peoples. So there are 4 questions that I want to ask in this talk. These are the 4 questions. And let me start with the first one. What is the problem about the idea of stateless peoples? Supposing that stateless peoples exist, no matter how we choose to define them for the time being, what is the problem to be solved? Here is my answer. The presence of many different peoples within a single state creates a problem because you cannot ask a people to renounce becoming a sovereign state and also renounce at the same time to be recognized by the encompassing state, that is the multination state. It is simply unjust if some peoples enjoy full sovereignty and full international recognition, while other peoples do not have their sovereign state and are not even recognized within the state that they share with some other peoples. This would clearly run counter to our intuition that all peoples should, in some sense, be equal. So that's the problem. It's the issue of recognition that is central to my claims. Individual persons need to be recognized. They may be recognized in their private lives as significant others in intimate relationships, benefiting from the love of parents, friends, or lovers. They may be recognized in society as equal citizens enjoying certain rights, and they may be recognized in the working place as professionals having certain abilities. A person with no relational identity whatsoever through recognition is only half a person. We seek recognition in our intimate relationships, in the systems of rights, and in liberties, and also at work. That's what we do. We seek for recognition. Now, just like individuals, peoples also need to be recognized. This is so, for instance, when a people becomes sovereign. The recognition by the international community is an indispensable condition that a people must meet in order to achieve sovereignty in accordance with international law. Similarly, stateless people should benefit from the same kind of recognition coming from the encompassing state. The recognition that would be provided by the multination state toward their component peoples would help them in exercising their self-determination. By the same token, it could perhaps also play a crucial role for the stability, the viability, and the legitimacy of the multination state. So the problem caused by the existence of stateless peoples is that, in general, they fail to be recognized by the encompassing state. But why don't we simply allow them to become sovereign states? In order to avoid the problem, the solution might indeed be to allow all stateless people to have their own sovereign state. After all, theoretically speaking, this would be an easy way out of the difficulty. But this is the traditional concept of nationalism as defined by Ernest Gellner at the very beginning of his book, Nations and Nationalism. According to Gellner, this traditional version of nationalism implies that it is based on the nationality principle, according to which the frontiers of the people should coincide with the frontiers of the state. In other words, each people should have their own state. There's also the alternative and somewhat milder principle according to which each people should, at least in principle, be entitled to have its own state, and at least enjoy the right to have its own state. Not necessarily exercise the right, but they would have the right to have their own state. It's a milder version because it's just saying that each people should have the right to have a sovereign state. It doesn't mean that they are going to exercise that right. However, from a practical point of view, the idea that each people should have their own state is a prima facie or have a prima facie right to become sovereign is extremely radical and carries with it insuperable difficulties of application. It is indeed hard to imagine what would happen if all peoples would have their own state. There would certainly be a tremendous turmoil all over the world. We would witness violence on a very wide scale. Radical geopolitical changes would have to occur. But there is an even more pragmatic argument to consider. I do not accept the principle according to which the frontiers of the people and the frontiers of sovereign states should be the same. I reject this traditional version of nationalism and thus the nationalist principle. But even if we were to accept it as a norm that must be implemented, we would still have to admit that this state of affairs is not about to occur. Imagine what would happen if the number of states were to increase and reach the number of 400 sovereign states within the next century. This would be twice as much as the actual number of states. An immense revolution would have to take place here. Even then, there would still be states that would have to accommodate thousands of stateless peoples. So it is perhaps important to look for alternative options to the traditional single nation state, because whatever happens in the future, for many decades, if not many centuries, there will be and will remain thousands of stateless peoples to accommodate, acknowledge, and recognize. We should therefore perhaps try to think about the conditions that could guarantee the future legitimacy, viability, and stability of multi-nation states. We should perhaps consider the possibility of implementing a recognition policy for the constitutive peoples of multi-nation states. Let me consider well, that was the problem that could be resolved by having all people to get their own state, but I would say that that would go with great instability. And in any case, this ideal is not about to occur, so we have to take into consideration multi-nation state. Let me consider now very rapidly 3 objections to the idea that there has to be some kind of recognition to take place. One traditional objection to this idea is that a fundamental distinction must be made between a civic concept of people and an ethnic concept of people. And it is usually thought that only the former concept is legitimate and that the ethnic concept is not legitimate. It is then assumed that all stateless peoples are ethnic, while sovereign peoples are civic. The conclusion is that the state should not implement politics of recognition for ethnic minorities. Of course, these claims are extremely controversial and for many different reasons. This is my reply to the first objection. It is first assumed that there is no legitimacy in ethnic peoples, and in Canada there are not all but some indigenous peoples who have an ethnic representation of themselves and are not aggressive, violent, or exclusive of other peoples. However, there are many indigenous people that can be described as perhaps ethnically homogeneous, or that at least entertain a national self-representation of themselves as ethnic peoples without deserving to be accused of ethnocentrism, xenophobia, or racism. Ethnic peoples are not necessarily aggressive and can, in principle, respect other peoples. Secondly, stateless peoples are not necessarily ethnic. Some stateless peoples are multi-ethnic and multicultural. They can be inclusive of minorities and respectful of those minorities. And third, the so-called civic peoples of a sovereign nation state may, as a matter of fact, put forward policies, institutional rules, and constitutional principles that are made to measure for an ethnic majority and are detrimental for minorities. In other words, the ethnic majority may influence the sovereign state into implementing ethnocentric policies. So the appeal to the distinction between ethnic and civic peoples is problematic if it is meant to discard the demands for recognition of constitutive stateless peoples. It certainly cannot be used by the state in order to remove itself from the responsibility to create favorable conditions for the development of minorities. There's another line of attack against the idea of having to recognize stateless peoples. It presents itself as less radical. It is simply suggested that there is something good in politics of recognition, but one must also be aware that at the very same time, the groups that are recognized on the basis of their ethnic origin can also be stigmatized by the very same act of recognition. Recognition, it is argued, is a double-edged sword. It can identify a minority that has been badly treated within society, but by the same token, it can also place some additional burden upon that group. The suggestion then is that one should be ambivalent concerning politics of recognition because they stigmatize as much as they recognize. Okay? So my answer to that is that there may appear to be a grain of truth into such a claim, but one should realize that the very first stigmatization occurs as soon as one decides to represent all stateless peoples in ethnic terms. It must be observed that the ethnic-civic dichotomy forces itself once again into that argument by implying that recognition is to be offered to a subgroup only if it can be identified in ethnic terms, that is, on the basis of ethnic origin. Understood in this way, recognition is automatically associated with an approach couched in less than civic terms. It is assumed that since the subgroup cannot claim to be distinctively characterized in terms of a common citizenship that it shares with the rest of the community, its distinctiveness can only be captured in ethnic terms. Asking for recognition is thus equated with the acknowledgement of ethnic origin. It can therefore be replied that the most important stigmatization is the one that comes from imposing the ethnic civic dichotomy when we are considering the possibility of recognizing stateless peoples. The ambivalence towards politics of recognition occurs only because we have chosen to stigmatize stateless people as a group having a specific ethnic origin. We have decided that demanding recognition is demanding for an acknowledgement of one's own ethnic origin. There is perhaps an important violence and stigmatization occurring as soon as we decide to interpret all the demands for recognition in this narrow-minded way. A third and final criticism that I wish to consider very briefly against politics of recognition is based on an opposite worry, for it is this time concerning the civic component of the ethnic-civic dichotomy. We are told that if recognition is couched in civic terms, we run the risk of forcing peoples into a particular legal system that has been created against them and that we are imposing upon them. This is particularly the case for indigenous peoples. In Canada, the Indian Act can perhaps be described as some sort of recognition, but it is one that is paternalist and plays against the very self-determination of indigenous peoples. Indeed, a system of apartheid involves some kind of legal recognition, but it is in a way a racist legal system. The solution to this problem is perhaps to accept that among all, and that's my answer, there is indeed perhaps a difficulty in recognition if it is to take place within the legal system imposed by the majority. But it is, in a way to resolve that problem, it is perhaps important to accept that among all the components of the right to self-determination, there is the right to choose one's own constitution, so that, among other things, indigenous peoples could be entitled to have their own legal system and be legally entitled to self-rule, even in juridical dimension. Even if we understand recognition as granting rights and affording a legal status, the very first legal status that the people must have is one that relates to its ability to decide which constitutional order corresponds to its own aspirations. This provision, I believe, should neutralize the tendency to force a people against its will into a legal mold that may itself be founded on misrecognition. So we have, in a way, answered the question that we were asking at the outset. What is the problem with stateless peoples? The answer is that stateless peoples are not recognized. And so we can immediately anticipate the solution that we should recognize them. The recognition of stateless peoples need not take the form of the creation of a new sovereign state. Just as peoples need international recognition when they want to achieve sovereignty, stateless people need to be recognized by the multination state in order to self-determine themselves within the state. But why should we recognize something whose existence has not been clearly demonstrated? What are peoples? Why should we enrich our social ontology with these strange entities? Why introduce a macro subject or social organism into our ontology? Is it not very problematic to talk about peoples, assuming that these things exist? Before directly tackling this question, we can immediately claim that peoples are already recognized in international law. Okay, it's notoriously difficult to provide a clear criticism. That's my second question. What kind of people are recognized? It is notoriously difficult to provide a clear criterion of application of the word people. So it may be wondered, is this not an impossible task? The first answer is that it is also very difficult to determine what persons are from an ontological point of view. But this does not prevent us from talking about the rights of persons. There are controversial ontological issues associated with the concept of people, but there are also controversial ontological issues associated with the concept of person. After all, the debates concerning personal identity have not been resolved. The boundaries of the concept of person are still blurred. Where does the person begin? Is it when the embryo is more than 5 months old in the womb of a woman? And where does it end? Is it just before turning into a vegetative state? These questions are not completely resolved, but they do not prevent us from ascribing fundamental rights and freedoms to persons, at least when these are understood as citizens. So even if the concept of person is not governed by fixed rules, it does not mean that we cannot operationalize it. We are able to do so because we consider only the institutional identity of persons. We consider them as citizens, or landed immigrants, refugees, permanent residents, and it is as having that kind of relational identity that we recognize them. So I recommend treating the concept of people in the same way. No matter what they are from the point of view of social ontology, peoples form societies or societal cultures understood as basic economic, social, and cultural institutions. Peoples may be organized into sovereign state or not. They may have governmental organizations or not. But as societies or societal cultures, they have an institutional identity. Here I use Will Kimlicka's concept of societal culture, involving first a structure of culture, that is, a language or many languages, institutions in which these languages are spoken, and history of those institutions. And also, in addition, peoples or societies or cultural, societal cultures, they have a character as well. They have customs, cultural habits, beliefs, values, specific goals for the group. Political liberalism takes peoples at face value as they are presented in the political realm. In that realm, they are institutionally organized societies. Even if they do not have a sovereign state or do not even enjoy self-government, they still have an institutional identity that must be respected and protected. For instance, the Acadian people has its own flag, its own language, its own history, celebrations, rituals, newspaper, and various other cultural institutions. So even without a government, it has an institutional identity. It forms a society or a societal culture. With such a political concept of people, we are able to use the term people as it occurs in international law. Of course, international law does not make use of a fully operational concept of people, but neither does it rely on a fully operational concept of person. Nevertheless, the concept of people is already operational enough. After all, international law recognizes first as peoples those populations that are organized into sovereign states. These are the populations that it welcomes in the United Nations. There are also clear references to the colonized peoples or to the peoples that are under siege, despotism, military occupation, or some other kinds of political oppression. Then, in 2007, international law also recognized indigenous peoples. Apart from that, it would only perhaps recognize as peoples those minorities that have been described as peoples by the environment, including the encompassing state in which they find themselves. Well, this is the case, for instance, for the population of Catalonia, because although the sovereign country of Spain does not recognize the juridical aspect of the people of Catalonia, they say that they are a people in the sociological sense. And that's all we need from the international perspective, I believe. The Constitutional Court of Spain recognized the population of Catalonia as forming a people in the sociological sense. Of course, it does not recognize that Catalonia forms a people in the juridical sense, but international law is able to describe as people those minorities that are treated as peoples in the sociological sense. It need not be bothered by the fact that the Spanish government refused to recognize it in the juridical sense. Since the population of Catalonia is treated as a people in the sociological sense, even by the encompassing state, it should have the status of people in international law. Similarly, for the federal government of Canada, and to a certain extent, the Supreme Court of Canada as well, they have recognized the existence of a Quebec people. In that sense, whatever international law has to say about peoples applies as well to the Quebec population. And to give a final example, it is also a very well-established fact that the population of Scotland forms a people. I was once told by a Scottish colleague that no one would ever dare denying the existence of a Scottish people. So when international law talks about all peoples, it refers, among other things, to the population of Scotland. Some other minorities may perhaps deserve to be described as peoples, but for our present purposes, it is already quite enough to work with the concept of people as it occurs in international law, for we are able to acknowledge the existence of peoples having sovereign states, of colonized and oppressed peoples, of indigenous peoples, and of some minorities that have been recognized by encompassing states as peoples. There are innumerable UN documents in which the word people is used. So if the clauses containing this word are to make sense in these documents, it must be on the basis of a pragmatic use, such as the one that I have just described. Peoples are societies forming either indigenous populations, colonized or oppressed people, whole population of sovereign states, or minorities that have been described as peoples by their encompassing state. To put the matter differently, there are objective and subjective epistemological criteria for peoples. I mentioned before that peoples present themselves in the political realm as societies or societal cultures, and this is the objective criterion. The subjective criterion relies on the habit of referring to the group as forming a people, either by members of the group or by the encompassing state. So we could want to say, and that's my main claim here, if it behaves like a people, describes itself as a people, and is recognized by the encompassing state as a people in the sociological sense, well then it is a people. It is this concept of people that is at work in various UN documents, and it is this common sense concept that is at the basis of my political concept of people. Can we say more about peoples, and shall we define the term? It is very difficult indeed. Maybe I will skip the section in which I was going to talk about a terminological caveat. It is the distinction between peoples and nation. For the present purpose of this talk, I won't be distinguishing the two. We could discuss the matter endlessly, but I believe that in the literature, in the use that people make of these notions, they tend to be quite similar. There are perhaps some distinctions, but I will skip that because I don't want to be late, and this is perhaps more like a technical matter. Okay. So I will go to the section where I talk about peoples. Most authors today agree that it is extremely difficult to come up with a simple, unequivocal definition of people. And this is my third question. What is a people? How should we define it? How could I have the nerve to say that I'm going to provide a definition? Nobody was successful until now And I'm not going to be successful in giving you the definition of a people. But the reason why it is so impossible, it's because there's not a single sort of people. I believe that there are at least 7 different sorts of peoples. So the reason why we were unsuccessful in defining what is a people is because there are many different sorts of people. The best way to get out of this dilemma is to adjust ourselves to the way people talk about peoples. If we do so, we will find out that the word people has many different uses. I think there are at least 7 different kinds of people corresponding to those uses. These different concepts correspond to different forms of national self-representation. In particular, there are ethnic, cultural, civic, sociopolitical, diasporic, multi-societal, and multi-territorial people. I'm sorry, it's late, and I'm talking about here as though I was teaching a class. But it's maybe useful to realize that there are a great variety of people. Let's consider, for instance, what I call ethnic people. It's my technical vocabulary, but it captures a use of the word people, the way people ascribe this property to certain populations. We represent ourselves as an ethnic people when we identify ourselves as sharing the same ancestral origins without self-government and are entirely contained within the limits of an already multination state. Here I use the word ethnic in a very restrictive sense than usual and not in the more traditional, wider cultural sense. Well, a certain number of indigenous peoples in Canada find themselves entertaining this kind of self-representations of themselves. They see themselves as sharing the same ancestral origin. And this gives us one concept of people. We represent ourselves as members of a cultural people when we believe we have different ancestral origins. But we share the same mother tongue, institutions, and history. We are still without self-government, and we are still entirely inside the frontiers of a sovereign state. Maybe the Roms of Romania, because the majority of them are contained within Romania, perhaps. If so, then Romanians would perhaps count as cultural people. The Acadians in New Brunswick also count as cultural people. No government, multi-ethnic, but nevertheless, same language, same culture, same institution, same history. We represent ourselves as civic people. Again, it's a technical terminology that I'm using here. When we share the same country, and there are no stateless peoples within that country. So, for instance, the populations of Iceland, Portugal, and Korea might have such a national self-representation of themselves. They are countries, but mono-national countries. Here, the word civic is understood in a more restrictive sense than usual, since I restrict its application to sovereign states in which it is believed that there is only one people. This is an important one because it concerns Quebec, Scotland, and Catalonia. We represent ourselves as a sociopolitical people when we are part of a population run by a government that is not sovereign, but that contains within its frontiers the world's largest sample of a group sharing the same language, same institutions, and history. There's also the diasporic people. We represent ourselves as members of the same diasporic people when we belong to a group whose members have the same languages, culture, and history, but who are scattered across different discontinuous territories as minority fragments of the people, and also as forming minorities on each of these territories. The best example is the former Jewish diaspora. We represent ourselves as members of a multi-societal people when we are part of a sovereign state who is seen by the state and the population as comprising several peoples. Great Britain, Spain, and Canada, for instance. Finally, we represent ourselves as members of a multi-territorial people when we see our group as sharing the same languages, culture, and history, but are also located on a continuous area that does not correspond to legally defined borders. For example, the Kurdish peoples, the Kurdish people occupies a non-fragmented area, Kurdistan, that crosses the official borders of existing states. This is also perhaps the case for the Mohawk people, who in Akwesasne occupy a territory that overlaps the territories of Ontario, Quebec, and New York State. In addition to these 7 sorts of people, it's not complicated enough yet. There are diasporas, not diasporic nations, diasporas. I have just introduced 7 sorts of peoples, but it is important not to confuse peoples and minority fragments of peoples. The various minority fragments of peoples do not describe themselves as peoples, nor do they ask for self-government or behave in nationalist movements. But they are national groups, all the same, sharing some features with peoples and are so entitled to collective rights. We can call them national minorities or ethnic minorities. First, there are what I call contiguous diasporas. Example of contiguous diasporas is the Russians in the Baltic states, the Palestinians in Israel, the Serbs in Bosnia, the Hungarians in Slovakia. They are extensions of neighboring peoples. We often call them kin minorities. It's population that, so to speak, find themselves on the wrong side of the borders. These groups do not describe themselves as forming all by themselves peoples. They never describe themselves as all by themselves forming peoples. So this is a special case of a minority fragment of people that should be entitled to collective rights. And there's also non-contiguous diasporas, and the best example of a non-contiguous diaspora is an immigration population. A population that was born outside of the country, that now lives in a new country, but that identifies with the foreign country, is a non-contiguous diaspora. They never describe themselves as forming nations all by themselves. Nevertheless, they are population that can be described as national group and entitled to rights as well. Okay, so this is my final question. Now that we've described the problem, peoples are not recognized. Now that we say, well, it's difficult to define it, but nevertheless, in international law, we use the word people. And there are fundamental principles applying to people. And even more than that, I believe that we can try to define people as long as we abandon the idea that there's only one kind of people, but there are many kinds of people. Okay, so given that, what is the solution? The solution, in a way, was already given. We should provide recognition to them. But how does this work? Peoples that own a legitimate sovereign government have, among other things, the right to independence, but there should also be rights for peoples that do not own a state. They have a right to internal self-determination and may even have the right to secession under certain conditions. We should be able to introduce side by side a regime of individual rights for persons and a regime of collective rights for peoples. And there are two different ways of recognizing peoples. By the international community and by the encompassing state. These two ways reflect two different ways of exercising self-determination. We usually understand the exercise of self-determination as leading to secession. When we talk about the right to self-determination, we immediately associate it's the idea of seceding, the creation of a brand new sovereign state, or the association of one people with a different state. The right to secede is also, it does not exhaust the right of external self-determination, because there's also the right of a people to associate to a different state by violating the territorial integrity of the state. But we mistakenly conflate self-determination with one particular form, that is external self-determination. But one should distinguish between external and internal self-determination. The right to external self-determination amounts to the right to own a state, or the right to secede and create one state, or the right to freely determine the state with which one wants to be associated. And the right to internal self-determination, by contrast, and here I will state the definition that occurs in all legal international documents, the right to internal self-determination is the right to develop itself economically, socially, and culturally, and it's the right to determine one's own political status within the encompassing state. The right to determine one's own political status within sovereign state. We are less accustomed to this latter form of self-determination. This in itself reveals that the issue of recognition by the encompassing multination state is one that has not been taken seriously enough by scholars and politicians. Just as peoples can only achieve external self-determination with the recognition of the international community, stateless peoples can only achieve internal self-determination with the help of the recognition by the encompassing state. So that's the definition of internal self-determination. And I believe that I go beyond here international law to reflect on different ways of implementing internal self-determination. We can be inclined to say that a people exercise internal self-determination when it is politically represented in the political instances of the encompassing state. That is, the central state is representative of the population as a whole and just not a national majority. This is the definition of the Supreme Court of Canada, by the way. A second way of exercising internal self-determination is the right to participate in all constitutional discussion within the encompassing state. This is the view, for instance, of James Tully. The third way for a people to self-determine itself would be to exercise the right to have its own constitution. That's another instance of internal self-determination. It seems to me that it applies to the situation of Catalonia. A fourth way would be to enjoy one's own self-government. Wilkim Licca very often seem to equate the right to internal self-determination with the right to self-government. The last and most perhaps important instance of internal self-determination is to enjoy a special and differential status within the states. Politics of recognition must not only allow for the establishment of an equal status, but also of a differential status, such as the one which is granted when a federated state, a province, or a region is entitled to a special juridical status. This implies a set of specific made-to-measure provisions that would enable the people to benefit from a special devolution of powers, or a special statute of autonomy, or asymmetric federalism. So that's the 5 kinds of internal self-determination. So what does international law state about peoples? It stipulates that they all have a right to internal self-determination. That is, a right, and it's everywhere in international law. All peoples have the right to self-determination in the internal sense. All peoples. That is, they all have the right to develop themselves economically, socially, and culturally, and the right to determine their own political status within the parent state. It also stipulates that colonized peoples and peoples subjected to oppression and a despotism, as well as those peoples whose right to internal self-determination has been violated, they all have the right to external self-determination. There's a clear provision in the 1970 Declaration on Friendly Relations Among States, in which it stipulated that a people may not violate the territorial integrity of a state that would respect their right to internal self-determination. This entails that if the state does not respect the right to internal self-determination, then the people may have the right to violate the territorial integrity of the state. Therefore, peoples have the right to their own sovereign state, and therefore exercise external self-determination, if they are either colonized, oppressed, or cannot self-determine themselves within the encompassing state. It is a well-known and established fact that colonized people, I'm late here, the definition in international law and external self-determination in international law. It is a well-known and established fact that colonized peoples or peoples that have been subjected to despotism are entitled to have their own state. It is less an established fact that a people is also justified to secede if it is not able to exercise internal self-determination. That is, if the encompassing state does not allow stateless peoples to develop themselves economically, socially, and culturally, and especially if the state is not able to respect the internal self-determination of the people, then the people is entitled to secede. So it becomes very important to determine under what circumstances a stateless people can exercise its internal self-determination. As I said, some say, oh, well, there's a violation of internal self-determination only if there's no political representation. If there is political representation within the state, then there is internal self-determination. This is what the Supreme Court of Canada says. And therefore it says, well, Quebec then may internally self-determine itself within Canada because they've elected prime ministers that come from Quebec. So they really are politically represented. Others describe self-determination as involving a continuous conversational participation in the revisions of the Constitution. As long as you are part of a discussion on constitutional matters, then you are internally self-determining yourself. This is the view of new constitutionalists such as James Tully. So the only case where you clearly find yourself confronted to a violation of your internal self-determination is if you cannot participate in constitutional conversation. Others will say that it's when you cannot enjoy self-government. This is, for instance, the view of Will Kimlicka. If you enjoy self-government, well, we can say that you have internal self-determination. But I would also add that in order to truly exercise your internal self-determination, you should be able to adopt your internal constitution. You should be entitled to do that. And you should be entitled to have a special status within the state. So, because sometimes a people may require some kind of special status. That is, a set of special, made-to-measure, institutional and constitutional provisions designed specifically for the stateless people. For instance, a people may ask for a formal recognition of itself as a people in the constitution of the country as a whole. It may ask for a special juridical status as a province. It may ask for asymmetric federalism. It may ask for some fiscal, special fiscal and political autonomy. By refusing, so maybe I would just say rapidly, there's no primary right to secede. It's always a remedial right to secede. That is, if you are subjected to an injustice, then you have the right to secede, whether it's because you are colonized, oppressed, or you cannot exercise your internal self-determination. But I would say that since the Spanish government refused the new statutes that were requested by the Catalan government and supported by the Catalan people, the Spanish Constitutional Court has failed to recognize the right of the Catalan people to internal self-determination. We've lived something similar in Canada. We were imposed a constitutional order, and we asked to remedy this situation by changing and reforming the Constitution, and it failed. So we are unable to internally self-determine ourselves within Canada in a specific sense that would require made-to-measure arrangement that allows us to determine our own political statute within the government. And if the British government is unable to deliver its promise of implementing massive devolution to Scotland, then once again, the Scottish people will be unable to self-determine themselves within Britain. So in Britain, Quebec, or Catalonia, we have experienced, in a strong, substantial sense of the word, the inability to exercise our internal self-determination. So maybe I'm at the end of my paper. In French, we were told once by Général de Gaulle, vive le Québec libre. I would say, vive la Catalogne libre. Thank you very much. Actually, I had many diapositives. This one is the only one that you should consider.
Bé, Michel, if you want
to sit,
you can use this in order to understand people
okay.
by asking, and then I don't have to translate. Les preguntes ja veieu, les podeu formular en català, les podeu formular en anglès, les podeu formular en francès. Si teniu l'aparell, en principi, en francès no sé si ens ho traduiran des d'allà a la cabina, però sí que ens ho traduiran. Per tant, en tots aquests idiomes és possible que fins i tot en llatí, ja que tots el parlem d'una manera o d'una altra, també ens entendrem. Bé, no sé quantes... Fem un torn d'aixecar mans. Una, dues. Comencem amb aquestes dues.
Bé, bona nit. Jo només voldria...
Si pot ser, fem la pregunta a poc.
Jo només voldria significar, quan sento parlar d'estat federal o federació d'estats, quina diferència hi ha entre una opció i l'altra?
Okay. Often a federal state is a state like Canada, for instance, or Germany, or the US. It's a sovereign state, but which contains within itself federated states. a federation of states. It's a play of words, perhaps, that was very popular in Europe, because those who believe in Europe, I am among those who believe in Europe, but some of them think that we should lean towards a federation of peoples. That is, you have sovereign states, but they are not linked together only by confederal link. With the confederation, in a traditional sense, each sovereign state has full veto on any decision. And we have moved in Europe to a situation where there are federative links. For instance, there's a central bank of Europe, and all the sovereign states delegated their sovereignty concerning monetary union to the central bank. So that's a federal link, which, when they are accumulated and when the sovereign states leave it to the European Commission or other instances to decide what's good for the whole of Europe, these are federative links. So it goes in the sense of what they call a federation of states. So it's sovereign states linked together by confederative link, but also by federative links. But they remain sovereign states. A federal state is a sovereign state containing provinces, landers, or federated states. That's my answer.
Bones. No se sent. Sí. La meva pregunta és si és suficient l'autodeterminació interna per evitar la secessió. És a dir, si es pot donar un cas en el que, tot i que l'Estat permeti l'autodeterminació interna, una nació vulgui independitzar-se i si en qualsevol cas seria legítima aquesta independència.
My view is that normally you can achieve completely all your goals within a sovereign state, a multination state. You want more autonomy, you want fiscal autonomy, you want your culture to be protected, you want to be able to enter into international relations on matters that relate to your own survival as a people, you can do it. So you can achieve a lot within a sovereign state that would seriously consider your internal self-determination. And I believe that although it's not perfect, it's perhaps in the ideal world, the best thing to do would be to have one's own sovereign state. But one must reflect upon this view. If you think that, well, even if I have internal self-determination, I still may have the right to become a sovereign state on the basis of what principle? Is it the principle according to which, in the ideal world, each people should have their own state? Is it rather the idea that all people should have at least the right to have their own sovereign state, although perhaps it's not always good to exercise the right? In my view, ideal theory must take into consideration reality. I'm a Rawlsian philosopher, and as a Rawlsian philosopher, I like the idea of a realist utopia. There are utopias that can be realist. At the moment, I don't see any realism in the idea that there should be 5,000 sovereign states. The average population of indigenous people in Canada is 10,000 individuals. And there are between, because nations are always under construction, there are between 50 and 80 indigenous peoples in Canada. The idea that all people should become sovereign is the idea that there should be between 50 and 80 indigenous sovereign states in Canada. If you consider other countries like India or Nigeria, it becomes absolutely crazy from a realist point of view to say, well, all these people should be entitled to sovereignty, even if they are granted internal self-determination. So my own approach is a bit realistic here. I say, no, we should not accept that principle. And so as a matter of a general rule, we should think that if truly a people is entitled to internal self-determination, then it would be problematic if we say, you're giving me all of this? Well, I don't care. I still want to become sovereign. I do not share this view because it is based on a certain principle of nationalism that need not be taken as a realistic in our modern world. But this entails that we are dealing with true internal self-determination. And we're so far away from that I agree with the international law when international law says that granting that we have now an insufficient number of conditions that have been agreed upon by the international community governing the process of secession, well, because we have not reached a convention on the conditions that justify secession, well, the international law stipulates that if a people decides democratically to become sovereign, if it goes, let's say, in a referendum or something similar, and if the international community recognizes that people, then international law will observe that there's a new sovereign state. And this is a provisional clause that I find very good, because in the absence of a full list of justification for secession, we have to be pragmatic also and accept that sometimes there's no clear violation in international law of internal self-determination, because the conditions that I've mentioned are not in international law. Because of that, we accept the effectivity principle, according to which if you democratically decide to be sovereign and are recognized by the international community, well, international law will consider that you are a new sovereign state, even if we were not able to formulate the conditions under which to secede.
A veure, què li diries o què li respondries a una afirmació que diu que el concepte nació no significa res fora de la teoria de qui l'ha criat pels seus propòsits? És a dir, que una nació és allò que els nacionalistes creuen que és una nació, és una mena d'autoafirmació. Què respondries a una afirmació així?
I answer that this is a double standard. There is a problematic aspect also to the notion of a person. What is a person? And we nevertheless find it no trouble to say that persons have rights. So similarly with peoples. And it's not only that the fact that there are groups, population describing themselves as people. It's international law. The Supreme Court of Canada has written a fantastic document in 1998, the reference case on the secession of Quebec. It's a highly sophisticated, finely analyzed argument. I have criticism, but I find it an extraordinary document. And they say that peoples and their right to self-determination is accepted in so many UN documents that you cannot provide the whole list. So there are numerous documents provided by the United Nations in which it is stipulated that all peoples have the right to self-determination. If this is to make sense, it's certainly because there is a certain operational use of the word people. As I said, given the document of the Supreme Court, not only do they say that the right to self-determination is accepted everywhere, but they say that it's more than a convention. It's not just a principle written in passing. It's more than a convention. So you have the international community that accepts that there are peoples that are sovereign in the United Nations. They accept that there are colonized peoples. They accept that there are oppressed peoples. They accept that there are peoples who all have the right to internal self-determination. That's what international law accepts. And you've got those academics who are saying, oh my God, your concept of people is a construction in your theory, on your paper, in your book. These peoples are disconnected with international law. So the problem is not with those nationalist people who are describing and defending the right of their people. The problem is with those theoreticians that are completely disconnected with international law. As the evening goes on, I gather more energy, and I will become passionate in a few seconds.
Why do you think the referendum in Quebec was lost?
Which one? The two of them? In both cases, the argument of fear, and of course it's useful because it applies to Scotland and it applies to Catalonia as well. People say, oh, well, yes, indeed, individuals have fear. It's fear of the unknown. I'm sorry, it's not fear of the unknown. It's the fear induced by the dominating people on the dominated people. You are told in Catalonia, and they were told in Scotland, that if they secede, oh my God, they won't join the European Union anymore. It's going to be very problematic. You will be outside, you will be floating with no particular grounding relationship with the rest of the Union. We were told, we have no European Union in North America, but we have the ALENA, that is the free trade between Mexico, the US, and Canada. Oh my God, if you remove yourself through secession, you remove yourself from ALENA. And we're going to have to consider and renegotiate your entry. And we're not sure that it's going to be possible because guess what? The Canadian government may exercise its veto for your return. There's same arguments in Scotland, in Catalonia, and in Quebec. That's one fear. Of course, fear of pensions, losing their pensions. As we witnessed the debate concerning Scotland, in Quebec, we were laughing because we thought that it was the same story all over again. You're going to lose your pensions. There will be economic turmoil. You cannot make it as a country of your own. We know that Scotland, Catalonia, or Quebec would be among the 30th countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita. So we would be, Catalonia, Quebec, or Scotland, among the very rich countries. But the fear induced in the population is what may be successful. And they call that democracy. I call that the politics of fear. And one thing that a nationalist must do is to be aware of the nationalism of the majority and their will to use anything in their power to maintain this domination. Therefore, we have to disconstruct, if I may use a theoretical term, disconstruct the arguments of fear, and this must be among the most important tasks of nationalists.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You just used the word nationalism, which you really didn't use in your talk, and I was sorry that you skipped the section on nation and peoples.
Okay.
And here's the reason why. I have sort of two reasons why. Here in Catalonia, to the extent I understand it as an outsider, the word nation is very important. Catalans feel themselves to be a nation. And yet that feeds into, on the outside, in terms of media coverage, etc., I see outside Catalonia and outside Spain, the sort of scary nationalism. and haven't used as much externally, or at least it hasn't gotten abroad in the news, in news coverage I've read in English, the notion of being a pueblo, being a people. And then, so that's vis-a-vis the outside beyond Catalonia and beyond Spain. But also within Spain, getting back to what you said about the dominant nationalism, I mean, there's a very, from my point of view, really interesting thing going on here where from the Spanish point of view, they can say that they can accuse the Catalans of being nationalists and that this is a terrible thing, and yet they don't even use the word nationalist about themselves. It's only you, Catalans are the nationalists, these terrible nationalists. And so it seems to me that the notion that in popular usage, which you seem to indicate, in English anyway, that nation and people are the same, in international law they are not the same. And so I just sort of wonder what to do about the conundrum, because I think it's something of a disservice for the notion of Catalonia as a national, being nationalist, because people on the outside don't understand that as the nationalism that I've come to understand. I mean, when I first got here, I was like, nationalism. And yet it is totally inclusive as opposed to exclusionary nationalism, which is what many people on the outside understand it to be mistakenly, if I make myself clear.
Okay. I could read the portion of my paper where I discuss the distinction between nation and people. But the most important thing that you are talking about is nationalism, and that indeed is something that I should have defined more clearly, because I reject the traditional view of nationalism as the coincidence of people with the borders of a state. I reject that traditional definition. But in my view, nationalism is the defense of the collective rights of people, including their right to internal self-determination. So that's turning nationalism into the promotion of collective rights. Moral collective rights if they are not registered anywhere, or legal collective rights when they are registered. Another thing that I would like to add is that indeed we define almost all the time nationalism as the thing that is shown by minorities. It's always minorities that are nationalists. Scottish nationalism, Catalan nationalism, Quebec nationalism, indigenous nationalism. There's no such thing as state nationalism, by the way. There's no such thing as a majority nationalism. Well, in actual fact, I believe that this is the most important kind of nationalism, because how do we explain the nationalism of the minority? It does not come from heaven. It comes from the denial, a systematic denial of the collective rights of the minority. When you've got a domination relation from the majority or from the state on its minority, this induces the nationalism of the minority. So there is the tendency to describe minority nationalism as something very mysterious that suddenly happened in the minds and hearts of people. It's irrational and we don't know where it comes from. It comes from domination. To what? To state nationalism. In a way, I'm anti-nationalist because I'm anti-state nationalism. The whole argument here is to preserve the collective rights of internal minorities. And if you are not able to do that, indeed, then that justifies nationalism in the exercise of external self-determination. But it comes from the state nationalism. It's so obvious to me. Okay, so that's the answer concerning nationalism. So you are perfectly right. I should have defined it, and I defined it in almost not legal, but in terms of collective rights, moral or legal collective rights of peoples. As far as nation and peoples, the reason why I use people, because in international law, the stateless population that interests me are called people. But why should we use the two words interchangeably, as I said? Well, I'm trying to adapt myself to the use that individuals are making of the notions of people and nation. Very rapidly, we often talk about First Nations. These are the indigenous peoples of Canada and the States and in New Zealand and Australia. But we also refer to them as indigenous peoples. We talk about the United Nations, but we also talk about the French, Italian, and German peoples. We are used to talk about nation and nationalism as well as nation-building policies and multi-nation states, but in international law, peoples are the bearers of the right to self-determination. We often refer to peoples, but we often describe the population involved as having a certain national consciousness. So the distinction between the two notions is increasingly becoming abstruse in the ordinary use of the word. It is true that in French, sometimes peuple has in the past been used in a more encompassing fashion so that it would in principle contain many different nations. Conversely, in English, the word nation has often been used precisely the other way around to indicate an entity encompassing perhaps many different peoples. But the more we are aware about the different uses in different languages, the more we realize how hard it is to justify the distinction between the two. So, because that's one of the reasons why, for the purpose of this talk, whenever I use the word people, you may change it to the word nation. If there is a distinction, it's perhaps because the word people refers a little more to the sociological group, and the word nation to the group with its institutional identity or political organization, and that's a distinction that I accept. In my papers, I say, yeah, we have to accept that there is such a fine distinction. But I happen to adopt, with John Rawls, a political conception of peoples. So my sense of people amounts to the sense in which we often call nations. That's another reason why I use the two terms interchangeably. But my main concern is to say when we talk about those notions, we should not engage into theoretical construction. We have to fit with the use of different people. I've introduced a terminology that one can find very technical, but it's not for any other reason than to try to adjust myself to the use of the word people by all sorts of individuals. So I use a technical term, but to capture one particular use of the ordinary term people. So it's not forcing the word people into a very restricted definition created by an academic thinking about the issue in its office. I try to adjust to the word people as it is used and also to the word nation as it is used, and very often it's almost interchangeably. That's why I've decided to. So that's the terminological issue, but I agree completely that as far as nationalism, that's a thing that I should have defined more precisely. Thank you very much.
Ja és gula gairebé. Una i una altra, si no s'allarga molt.
Bueno, primer de tot, gràcies per l'exposició tan clara que ha fet. I, a veure, aquest matí, en un debat que s'ha fet, un dels ponents ha parlat de la repatriació de la Constitució a Canadà. Volia saber si això té, suposo que sí, relació amb el dret a l'autodeterminació que, com ha dit, que va reconèixer el Tribunal Superior, em sembla, de Canadà, i si, per altra banda, això, segons el seu punt de vista, és exportable, és a dir, importable per nosaltres aquí a Catalunya, i sota quines condicions creu que es podria fer. Gràcies.
I will answer you without being sure that I completely understood your question. Tell me if I'm wrong. It was argued, I was there this morning, but shame on me. I do not understand Catalan very well. But I heard when they would talk about patriation, Canada and Quebec, suddenly I raised I was curious, and is your question about the relationship between the patriation of the Constitution and the protection of the internal right to self-determination by the Quebec people?
Yes, yes.
Okay. It is indeed, oh my God, you have 2 hours? No, I have 2 minutes, I know. It is indeed an argument made by the Supreme Court in 1998 in the fantastic document that I mentioned before, the reference case on the secession of Quebec. Their main argument, according to James Tully, and I think James Tully is right, their main argument is to say that the constitutional order of 1982 is not a straitjacket. It is not a straitjacket. And the reason why it is not a straitjacket is because, as they show in their document after that, they show that Quebec, if Quebec were with a clear question, get a clear result on sovereignty within the Quebec population, they would have the right to try to achieve sovereignty. They would need, therefore, though, to have a negotiation, and a negotiation on a constitutional amendment. And the rest of Canada would be forced to negotiate this constitutional amendment. And if they were not to do it, Quebec would be legitimate to secede. If they were willing to, but the negotiations would not be successful, then Quebec could try to declare unilaterally its own secession. And if the international community, looking at legitimacy and legality, would say, well, it's legitimate, then Quebec becomes sovereign. They've shown this in their document, and since they show this, they say, look, the constitutional order of Canada, with 4 underlying principles, allow Quebec to secede in a legal way as long as it negotiates a constitutional amendment with the rest of Canada. So it shows that the Canadian Constitution is not a straitjacket. What? And now I'm going to have to... it will be an additional minute only. What is my worry is that they do not discuss the amending formula. To get a big amendment like this, obviously, you need the unanimity of all provinces. The amending formula within the Constitution is one that varies. Some mild changes require only the agreement of the province and the federal state, and you can change the Constitution. Other amendments are more substantial. They require the agreement of 7 provinces with representing more than 50% of the population. Another modification to the constitutions require the unanimity of all provinces. To get an amendment that would allow Quebec to secede, you need the unanimity of all provinces. Do you seriously believe that you're going to get it? Of course we won't. But that's the amending formula of the constitutional order. So if we agree that we cannot, through the amending formula, be able for Quebec to become a sovereign state, then it means that the Constitution is a straitjacket. They are wise. The Supreme Court says, in passing, it's too early to determine the kind of amending formula that we're going to use. When we get to that point, you come back to us and tell us what is the kind of particular amending formula you're going to use, and we'll consider it. So it's either that you have to accept the constraints of the amending formula, and therefore you know that even for a very mild reform, like the Meech Lake Accord, it was 5 minimal clauses that would never have changed the life of Canadians. It was so minimal that I was against it. It was too minimal. and it failed, and it required the unanimity of all provinces. So even for a small reform of the Canadian Constitution, you cannot do it. That's why every political scientist will say it's a constitutional straitjacket. If you otherwise find it possible to counter the amending formula and decide that for a special circumstance like that, it will be a negotiation with the Quebec people and the Canadian government, and we will forget the amending formula, then indeed, that would not be a constitutional straitjacket, but that's not the Constitution of Canada. The Constitution of Canada contains an amending formula that you must respect. So it's admitting that you have to admit that it's a constitutional straitjacket, and here I'm proud to refute the Supreme Court of Canada. If there's another question, I go crazy. I like it.
Brief one.
Fer referència al debat del matí, un dels arguments dels ponents, un dels ponents que estava en contra, diguéssim, o en no, de que no continua tenint sentit parlar d'entitats nacionals en el segle XXI, posava sobre la taula la possible manipulació dels sentiments. És com que el sentiment nacional és com una cosa que varia, depèn de no sé què. I per tant, quan hi ha una auge nacional, diguéssim, venia a dir, no sé si l'he interpretat malament a ell, que com que si hi ha una manipulació a darrere, això sorgeix més, i quan no, doncs no. I enllaçant-lo amb el que acabes de dir tu ara, de que quan l'estat plurinacional s'hi dona drets a una minoria, això vol dir que aquesta minoria s'acomoda i no es posa a demanar la seva part nacional, si això és determinant o no. No sé si m'ha explicat en aquesta part final. De que la minoria, faig un exemple a Catalunya. A Catalunya ara vivim una situació de demanda política amb milions de persones al carrer. Fa 4 dies no. Hi ha qui interpreta que abans estàvem com acomodats i ara com que tenim dificultats econòmiques, amb el context de la crisi i tal, doncs ara hi ha demanda. Hi ha qui ho diu. Per tant, quina resposta donaries al tema emocional, diguéssim, i de la minoria quan es troba en una situació de més drets o menys drets?
It seems to me that it's a particular instance of what we were discussing from a very theoretical point of view a few minutes ago. State domination is responsible for minority nationalism. If the Constitutional Court, and even before, the Parti Popular, would not have asked those questions to the Constitutional Court, and if the Constitutional Court would have said, the new statutes are fine, we wouldn't be here right now. So who is manipulating the sentiment? Who is behaving in a way that forces populations to react emotionally to what's going on? I must say, I indeed react emotionally. When I see the population of Catalonia in the streets with their flags, millions of them in a chain, I think it's extraordinary. Maybe it's emotional, but it's an emotional reaction that is justified because they are reacting to the domination of the Spanish government upon them. So let's not look at the problem created by minority nationalism. Look at the responsibility of the state nationalism that imposes its domination on a minority. That's where you have to look. And in the case of Catalonia, in relationship with the Spanish government, it's a perfect scholarly example of that kind of domination.